Good afternoon if you're on East Coast time, and good morning if you're on West Coast time or just about the end of the morning. My name is Jason Eckert. I am the Chief Operating Officer for Vision Serve Alliance. Vision Serve Alliance works with AVLNC, administers the AVLNC committee. And this is a workshop, a webinar for us to discuss things that are related to the Older Americans Act and how to advocate for them, how to advocate for that, what that is, and how to move some of our mutual interests forward. So again, a couple of people are still joining us. We will go till about 4:30. We will have a few speakers that will be talking with us. We are doing this in a meeting style. So because it is a meeting style, we do not have the Q&A option. That is purposeful on our part. If you have questions as we go through, we would like you to put the questions into the chat. So you'll be able to see the questions will come through the chat. They will go to our administrators, which in this case will be Helen Chapman and Lee Nasahi. And at the end of our program, we'll get to some of those questions for that Lee will put out there. Read the question and get some responses, and we can unmute people if they need to, address us directly in any way. Again, I'm just reflecting a few more people are coming on in to the call here. Many of you are very active in the VSA and AVLNC. We hope if you're coming as an outside member and you're not active, that this will be a launching point for you to get active, your organization to join to join VSA, or you as a person who's interested in this to become a member of AVLNC. So we really do encourage that to occur. This is really a group of tremendous folks who are working very, very hard to move these ideas forward. Because we're so pressed for time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions. I think most of us know each other. Some of our guests, however, deserve some introduction, and I am going to throw that over to Priscilla Rogers. Many of you know Dr. Rogers for the terrific work she's done and the dedication that she has had to advancing vision rehabilitation services and other services to the blind and vision impaired community, and specifically, most recently, to her work with aging Americans on this topic. So to introduce our first presentation, I am going to hand it over to Priscilla Rogers.
Hey, Jason, thanks a lot. Appreciate it very much. I am just delighted to introduce Allison Council, who is the Aging and Economic Policy Director for the Senate Aging Committee. In that role, she handles the aging services work for Senator Casey, as well as consumer protection issues across the lifespan. She's been in this role about a year, but before that, she worked for Senator Blumenthal on healthcare, consumer protection, and aging issues. I've heard Allison speak before at several meetings, and she does a great job. And like I said, I'm just excited that she is here with us today. So I'm now going to turn it over to Allison. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for the warm welcome. I'm happy to be here today. I'm happy to answer any questions as you all have them. That was a wonderful introduction, and I think really sums it up. But I do work for Chairman Bob Casey on the Senate Aging Committee, handling aging services, which, of course, related to this conversation, includes the Older Americans Act. So I'm going to run through a bit of the process and what we're doing in the Senate on OAA. I'll also talk a little bit about the House and just some priorities we're looking to advance. I will also say that I work very closely with another member of my team, Dory Finney, on this. So don't be surprised if you see emails or get replies from one or both of us. We are a team on this issue. So with that, I'll jump into a little bit about the process. So Older Americans Act is up for reauthorization. It expires on September 30th of this year. I kind of hate to use the word expires because really the programs will keep operating if we do slip past that deadline. But of course, our hope is that we get this done before September 30th. We on the Senate Aging Committee have been involved historically in the reauthorization process of the Older Americans Act. We, under Senator Casey's leadership last time, reauthorized the bill, and prior to his chairmanship on OAA, aging has been involved. And as recent as last week, we actually had a hearing on Older Americans Act, and the importance of the act for local communities and older adults in those communities. So it's really kind of deeply embedded into the fabric of the Aging Committee, and something that the senator is very personally devoted to. That being said, we are working with other members in the Senate on reauthorization. The Help Committee is, of course, the Committee of Jurisdiction, so we are working with folks on help to get this done. We currently have an 8-member bipartisan working group, and that includes Senator Casey, Senator Braun, who's our ranking member on the Aging Committee, as well as Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Cassidy, Senator Markey, Senator Kane, Senator Collins, who also has historically been involved in OAA, and Senator Mullen. So a pretty large, diverse group for reauthorization. And so far, we have been meeting regularly to go through priorities. Um, in fact, I can't stick around after my presentation because I have to go back to a reauthorization meeting. But we meet very regularly and we talk through kind of our priorities. As you all may have seen, we had an RFI that went out earlier this year, that asked for priorities from stakeholders. And that was very essential in us developing our priorities and seeing where there's consensus among advocates and really kind of the desire to move OAA forward, and modernize OAA. So we started with the RFI, and then we moved from that process on to presenting individual senators' priorities. And those priorities, of course, are reflective of what we've heard from advocates and folks in states. And we're sharing text back and forth and really negotiating on the finer details. I think the larger bill will come together after we kind of work through some of these kind of larger discussion points. I'd say common themes that come up and include nutrition and funding, among many others. It's a pretty diverse group of interests given the diverse group of members. So process is moving along. I would say that we are hoping to have some sort of discussion draft sometime in July. So expect to hear from us then. But as always, we are accepting comments and feedback as we go through the process. And so always welcome an email and happy to answer questions as we move through that. Um, the Senate is, of course, driving this process. The House, as we all know, will have to go through their own process to pass the bill, but we have not heard interest from them in moving forward anything right now. And I think they have other things on their plate that they are focused on. We don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. And in fact, we're focused very much on our negotiations over here and hoping that we can get a bill that both caucuses can agree to, and that can pass out of the Senate. And it is our hope that the House will pick up that package that has been agreed to on a bipartisan basis, and reflective of the priorities of the 8-member working group. And we'll pick that up and pass it, whether that's in a package at the end of the year or hopefully something before then, before September 30th. Um, I think education from members is always, always, always appreciated, whether that's in the Senate or on the House side. Um, Staff members change over time, and I don't think many folks are actually truly familiar with the work of the Older Americans Act and how it is actually playing out in their communities. And I think one of the biggest selling points for OAA is that it is really translated at a local level. And many folks get services through OAA and may not even realize that the programs that they're receiving are federal programs. So really helping staffers understand that. and get acquainted with OAA because it will start coming up more and more over the next few months. I think is always appreciated. Um, I do think we are going to face some challenges throughout this process, and we have already encountered a few that our group is committed to working through, but are really reflective of overall kind of disagreements between both caucuses. Funding is a big priority for Senator Casey and for the Democratic members of the working group. We want to see increases in authorization across the board. We know that providers have been working on very little, and we know that the demand for services is very high, especially after the COVID pandemic. And we want to meet the needs of more older adults. And really meet them where they are, and unfortunately we need funding to do that. And that has been it's a really tough sell for our counterparts, and we're going to continue to push that, but that will be a challenge. So as much as we are focusing on funding, we're also talking about ways to modernize OAA and kind of make the funding more flexible to allow states and localities to use the funding in the best way that they see possible and can maximize their dollars. So being creative there and appreciate patience as we go through this process, because I don't think this is going to be as transformational of an OAA as I think we would like, but really want to focus on preserving what we have and making sure that we move the needle as much as we possibly can throughout this process and in this kind of difficult period here. Um, I went through timeline already, but I think just generally, nutrition is one of the things that we keep hearing about. Long-term care ombudsman and APS and elder justice generally is something we hear about pretty frequently. Funding is another topic, really all across the board. So that is a high-level overview, and I'm happy to answer questions about the process, about the content, or anything else. Thanks all. I think you're muted.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you, Allison. We're a pinch ahead of schedule, so I could rely on Helen or Lee if there's one or two questions that come up for you right in this moment in the chat. We might be able to take
There
those.
aren't any yet.
Okay,
I can't see any. Helen, do you?
There is a question. Yeah, it's from
Okay.
Okay.
Nancy.
Okay, I guess you'll
That's
do it.
why I was asking if you could see them.
Yeah.
So Nancy asked, is Senator Casey ensuring that the reauthorization of the OAA is consistent with the new federal implementation regulations of Section 504 effective July 8th, 2024?
Yeah, that is a huge priority of Senator Casey's, and obviously, my team. I don't work directly on 504, but my team that does has done some great work there, and so that is something that we are absolutely thinking about as we go through this process, and something that we will continue to monitor with ACL.
So, Allison, this is Mark Reichert with AER, and I co-chair the policy committee with Chris, as you know. And so I'll ask, since sounds like we have a minute, I really would love for you to amplify for our people what you said a moment ago, which is, it sounds like the House of Representatives is in its own world, and you all are working through a process. September 30th will be here before we know it. It sounds like we're going to be living with this for a very, very long time. We have to be prepared for anything. But what words of encouragement would you offer to our attendees on this call today about, frankly, hanging in there for the long haul, because it seems like we're going to be in it for the long haul?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've seen these processes play out before, and I will say that this is a unique area of policymaking that we can have a bipartisan group of folks at the table that very, very much care about OAA and moving it forward. The disagreement lies in funding and in some statutory language, but everybody is behind the intent here, and that is not something I can say about everything that we work on.
For sure.
So, I mean, if we're thinking back on history, the last reauthorization also was stalled. Not saying that this one is stalled yet, but and we hope that it doesn't. But the last reauthorization did stall, and it ended up passing, I think, 6, 6 months late. But programs move forward, and all it takes is kind of one kind of shift in language and shift in agreements to get something over the finish line. So we're all committed to the path, and I don't think we'd still be at the table pushing to move this forward if that wasn't the intent and the hope.
Right. Yeah, good. Thanks.
Allison, we're going to go over our RFI with this group in just a few minutes, but we had sent it to you all about wanting to have vision included in the definitions and in vision rehab as well. I'm assuming you agree that we need to keep pushing that forward and seeing what will come out of it.
Yeah, I think continuing to push and educate on the reasons why you want to see that language included, particularly for members of the working group, but really focusing on help down dais members and aging committee down dais members is most impactful there. So again, education is great, and amplifying that RFI and that request as much as possible.
We have a follow-on question from Nancy, and then also Doug has a question as well. So from Nancy, in many ways, the federal OAA guidelines are more flexible than how they are implemented by the state. Is there a way to monitor the states so they are as flexible as the federal regulations allow?
Yeah, I think the federal regulations are intended to allow states to implement the the statute how they see fit and how best works for their communities. And then more on the local level, AAAs have the flexibility to um, implement programs that work best for their smaller communities. And I know that counties in Western Pennsylvania do things differently than counties in around Philadelphia. So I think one of the things that we're thinking about is contracting language with AAAs. There has been some push in recent years. I think this has mostly come out of ACL, but there has been some other areas where this has come up, requiring AAAs to get approval from their states for every contract they enter into. And that could be as small as renting a room for an event, or as large as contracting with a healthcare provider for some service. So I think we are pretty concerned about that, because we want to amplify the flexibility that AAAs and the states have. So that's one way to think about it. But I think, again, why OAA is so unique is that the federal government provides flexibility, and then states can pick that up and determine how it works best in the state. And AAAs can do the same.
Helen, go ahead and ask. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Nancy. Go ahead and ask Doug's question, and then we will move forward. I'll toss things back to Chris.
Yeah,
Chris.
I didn't do the
Oh,
chat.
go ahead, Doug.
So.
I forgot. You can speak.
I was disturbed last week when modernization of the act was talked about, and what was talked about was people having choice about their meals, and including the LGBTQ plus community, which doesn't mean that I'm opposed to those things, but we've been flooding. I thought we were flooding the committee and the working group with the issues of blindness and low vision, and how there's such a need for rehab services to keep them out of institutionalization. And so I'm wondering, is this being talked about? It feels like everybody thinks that we're a special interest that is trying to get funding for our programs. And my concern is, everybody who gets old is going to have vision problems, practically everybody. And so we're not really a special interest. We're paving the way for everybody. So I wish there were a way that we could get that across. So those are my questions. Are we getting that across? And is there, I haven't heard discussion of our specific issues anywhere. So I just want to ask you, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think I can answer this, and let me know if I'm not exactly answering your question. But we um I think you are getting it across. So yes, I think, and that is coming up in the group, and I think that's something we're thinking about in terms of kind of the elevation of LGBTQ plus issues. That was raised last week in the context of the hearing, because ACL specifically within their final rule expanded upon Congress's language, um, indicating that social factors are can be one of the reasons and one of the ways to target services under the greatest social need, greatest social and economic need, and that is how kind of AAA's go about implementing the programs and determining who will get services. And so LGBTQ individuals were added in that list to provide clarification to AAA's, and this really should have been something that was already being done. Um, and so that was just a number of many social factors that were added under that list. And, it wasn't a true list of every single factor that would require additional attention and services, um, just providing additional clarification on some of the social factors in particular. And so that came up in that context, but I do think you're doing a good job in terms of, conveying this message and amplifying the need for um, targeted services.
Thanks.
Well, we will take that positive encouragement that we're doing a good job. So thank you, Allison, for sharing that. We are right
Jason,
on we are right on time here. So I'm going to toss things back to Pris Rogers. But before I do, I want to remind folks, of course, we're being recorded, just so you know that. And we did put in the chat some of the materials that you can use for advocacy, and some of the members of the health committee member list, as was identified by Allison. And I didn't give us a structure. So Pris will introduce our next speaker, who is Meredith. That will be followed up by Pris and Mark talking with us for a little bit, and then a little bit of Doug Powell talking with us for a little bit, and then more questions and answers at the end. If you have any more questions for Meredith, go ahead and put them in the chat. We will forward them to Pris, and Pris will get some answers from Meredith for us. Pris, let me give you the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, who will be using some slides. And also, I'll be the first to thank Allison, but I know, Pris, you want to introduce and thank as well. Over to Pris Rogers.
thanks, Jason. And yes, Allison, thank you so much. That was great. We really appreciate what you had to say. And if anybody has questions for Allison, just email me, and my email is going to be in the chat. I understand, prisrogers@gmail.com. So please email me, and I'll get those questions on over to Allison, because I know she said a lot of things, and I'm sure when you go back and think about it, you may have other questions. So thanks again, Allison, for a great presentation.
Thanks for having me. And again, feel free to reach out anytime. And I can also put my email in the chat, but thanks all.
Okay, thank you. Go back to your meeting. I know you got to do it, so I know how these go. All right, I now have the great pleasure of introducing Meredith Chalemi, who is a gerontologist near and dear to my heart, and Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Leading Age California. She has a great background in various social services and healthcare settings, including life plan communities. She's been involved in programs funded by the Older Americans Act, which is why we wanted her to come today, because she knows so much about the Older Americans Act. And she has served as the director of Medicaid and HCBS policy for Leading Age. And the way I got to know her, which is why we invited her, is that she worked for a time for Helen Keller National Center for Deaf, Blind Youth and Adults as the older adult specialist. So we got to bring her into our arena at that time. So now we have a person who has knowledge about us and about the Older Americans Act. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Meredith. Thank you.
Thank you, Pris, and good afternoon, everyone. I really am happy to be able to spend time with you today following the wonderful presentation from Allison. We'll be talking a little bit more about the Older Americans Act. Pris and Mark asked me to give an overview of the aging network, the state plans, the local plans, talk about some new regulations, and then I will touch on some of the reauthorization statements that Allison also had presented on. Next slide. So the Older Americans Act, as we just heard, supports a wide range of social and health-related services and programs for older adults. A lot of people, like Allison mentioned, are not familiar with the Older Americans Act. They may realize that they get a home delivered meal, or they go to their local senior center for lunch, or they get some family caregiver support, or they call a long-term ombudsman, but they don't realize that all of these programs are federally funded through the Older Americans Act. The Older Americans Act also provides part-time opportunities in community service for unemployed low-income older adults. That program is called CSEP, and that's something that's really important part of the act in most communities. And like we have been talking about, these programs and services focus on supporting older Americans to live in their homes and communities, and to focus on keeping people out of institutions as much as possible. So talking a little bit more about the background and legislative history, the Older Americans Act, like many of social programs, was created in the 1960s and was enacted in 1965. There was really a call at that time for federal advocacy in the field of aging. A lot of folks were living longer for the first time. And I remember when I was a student at the University of Southern California gerontology program, our professors told us that older adults were living in terrible conditions and many times didn't have enough food to eat. There were even folks that were buying dog food that was really cheap at the time and eating that instead of human food. So there was a real big call to action that something had to be done for older Americans to be able to live in the community. So Congress did create the act at that time and created the Administrative on Aging, which you may hear called ACL more often now. They're in the same house. So the Administrative on Aging, or the Administrative for Community Living, is really the federal agency that provides all the grants for the social services, research, and training that benefit older adults. So that's a little bit about the background, and you'll hear a lot about 50th anniversary celebrations around the country now for the Older Americans Act coming up. So eligibility is a big thing that also people sometimes are confused about. And the Older Americans Act in general mandates that older adults must be age 60 and older to participate in the programs and activities. There is no means test like there is for Medicaid for eligibility. States must target programs and services to individuals with the greatest economic and greatest social needs, which are defined in the statute as follows. The greatest economic need means the need resulting from an income level at or below the poverty line. And the greatest social need means the need caused by non-economic factors like we just talked about, including physical and mental disabilities, language barriers, and cultural, social, and geographic isolation. Now, I should point out here that even though they are targeted towards the greatest economic need, that doesn't mean that people that aren't in need can't participate. For example, for home delivered meals and senior center meals, you'll find people of all incomes, and the states are allowed and the counties are allowed to have people have a donation for these programs as they can afford it. But if there is a waiting list, or if there is a higher demand than the area agencies on aging can participate with, they do target the programs for greatest economic need and greatest social need. So the current law for the Older Americans Act is broken into 7 titles. So when you're around people from area agencies on aging, or ACL, you may have people throw around the different titles without exactly describing what they are. The Title I sets the policy objectives and defines the terms under the Act. So creating the infrastructure for the aging network. The Title II is the Administration on Aging, and establishes the administrative functions for the executive branch by the Assistant Secretary for Aging. Title III is where a lot of the programs that we find in the communities are housed. So most discussions on the Older Americans Act are about Title III. And these are the grants for state and community programs on aging. This is the nutrition programs, the supportive services like the home delivered meals and congregate nutrition, disease prevention and management, family caregiver services and supports, and all of those sorts of programs. So if you have to delve into one of them and learn it best, Title III is where it's at. Title IV is activities for health, independence, and longevity. That's more of the grants for research, innovation, and training. Title V is the part-time employment for training for low-income older adults. Title VI are grants for Native Americans. And Title VII is the vulnerable elder rights protection activities that allows the APS and Ombudsman program to have funding. So as Allison mentioned earlier, the Older Americans Act funding is provided in annual appropriations through the Departments of Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education and Related Agencies Appropriations Act. In fiscal year 2024, the total funding was $2.4 billion. So I don't know how that hits you. It doesn't seem like a lot of money for such a large program for all 50 states and the territories. So the other thing that people refer to is the Aging Network. What really is that? Well, like I mentioned, most Older Americans Act programs are administered by the Administration on Aging within the Administration for Community Living. So lots of new acronyms here. Every field has their acronyms. And those all operate under HHS at the federal government. The Older Americans Act establishes a network of states, tribal organizations, local agencies, service providers, and volunteers that plan and provide all of these services. And that is who the Aging Network is. In order to receive any funds from the federal government, states have to establish a state agency referred to as States and Territorial Units on Aging, or SUAs. Some states may just call it, for example, the California Department of Aging. Some states have more unique titles, but each state has this entity. And it's responsible for planning and policy development, as well as administration of all of the activities under the Older Americans Act. And then when you get to the state level, states have to designate area agencies on aging, which are called AAAs, not the automobile club, but the area agency on aging that operate within one or more planning and service areas. They are the local entities that contract with local service providers. They can be either government agencies, for example, a county can be the host of a AAA, or it could be a nonprofit, and they oversee the delivery of social, nutrition, and long-term services and supports to older adults in the community. Like I mentioned, the state areas units on aging are responsible for developing and administering a multi-year plan, state plan that provides goals and objectives, as well as assurances under the Act. Typically, the state plans are for 4 years at a time. They are not all on the same 4-year cycle. So when you look at various states, you'll see that their plans may overlap and cover different four-year groups. But this is something that you can see for every state. So I would say that it's a really great idea to look up where your state is in the 4-year plan. You can read over the executive summary and the longer document, and lots of states even provide recordings of stakeholder sessions that they had as they were forming this plan. And then just like that, the AAAs at the local level are responsible for developing area plans that are submitted to the states. And most of the states where they host on the internet where their state plan is, they'll also have the area plans that you can click and review for the different areas. So the money comes in grants, and this is something that is unique, I think, about the Older Americans Act. There's both formula grants and competitive grants. So for the formula grants, the states, U.S. territories, and tribal organizations are allotted funding through statutory formulas. They can also be referred to as mandatory grants. And so this program funding is based in large part on the population-based formula. So states that have more of a population that is at a higher age are due to receive more money. And then states that have younger populations will receive perhaps a minimum grant allocation. For some of the formula grant programs, states are required to provide a matching share. So for example, for the supportive services, congregate, and home delivered meals, states are required to provide a 15% matching share. And for the family caregiver program, the share is 25%. There are also some competitive grants that ACL will fund to states and local governments, nonprofit organizations. A lot of this has to do with Alzheimer's education, and also it has the competitive grants focus on health and wellness programs and evidence-based programs for improving population health. So the OAA has been in the news a little bit more recently because not only of the reauthorization that Allison talked about, but because the program regulations have been looked at for the first time since 1988. So wow, that has been such a long time. I know that I've heard other presentations and people say, think back, what was life like in 1988, how have things changed? and why were these regulations left untouched for such a long time. So since 1988, the population of older adults has nearly doubled. Older adults are living longer than ever before, and older adults have changed their expectations, and we have, as a society, have changed expectations about what it means to age well. Almost all older adults want to live in the community, and nearly 95% do. And some of you policy wonks may say, why did we look at these regulations instead of first revising the statutes? Usually statutes are revised before regulations. Well, ACL wanted to have a regulatory update before the retirement of Edwin Walker, who is the Assistant Secretary. So that's why this was pushed before the statutory overview. Like I mentioned before, the OAA budget is about 2.4 billion. And there is a nice resource that I've put in these slides, which is a summary from the Congressional Research Office that talks a little bit more about the OAA and what's going on with the regulations. So there is a final rule that is updating the OAA regulations. And really the objective is to update the regulations to align with the current statute, to reflect the needs of today's older adults, and make it so that we are in 2024 instead of 1988 when we're thinking about older adults, is to promote appropriate stewardship of OAA resources, to clarify programmatic requirements, and the larger lofty goals are to support the National Aging Network that delivers the services and to improve program implementation to better serve older adults and their caregivers. So states are going to be very, very busy. The final rule was posted to the Federal Register on March 15th, 2024, and already the compliance date of October 1st, 2025 is looming. There are a lot of policies and procedures that states and area agencies on aging will have to work on. They're going to have more consistency in their definitions and operations between the state and tribal programs. The Act clarifies and strengthens provisions for meeting the requirements with people of greatest social and economic needs, talks about a broader range of people who can receive services, delves into how the funds can be used more clearly. There's more fiscal requirements, and there's a lot more policy and procedure that the final rule establishes, especially about things like conflicts of interest. So there's going to be a lot of behind the scenes work that has to be done at the state level. State agencies who are unable to comply by October 1st, 2025 are going to have the ability to submit a corrective action plan to the federal government. And if that is approved, then they will have additional time to achieve total compliance. But as you're interacting with your state agencies, you may notice that they're really focused on this administrative side of things, and that they're spending a lot of time on their implementation timeline, and also that they're working with ACL to get technical assistance in order to comply. And here's just a link to the final rule. In your free time, you might want to peruse it, see all the updates that have been made, and there's also a summary sheet that ACL has provided so that you can see the highlights of what has changed. So there's I also have a link here about the rule. There are fact sheets, additional resources. There is information on upcoming webinars and other updates. So if you want to see what your state agency might be hearing about and thinking about, the public is invited to attend. And ACL is, like I said, going to be providing robust technical assistance and engaging stakeholders in implementing the final rule on both the state plans on aging, area plans, the funding formulas, contracts and commercial relationships. There's a lot of new emergency and disaster requirements from lessons learned during the pandemic. There's some changes in nutrition, and also there's a focus on legal assistance and alternatives to guardianship. Next slide. So I know that Pris and Mark and this coalition is going to be talking a lot more about your advocacy, but the AAAs are also supposed to be in the advocacy business, and they are one of the only organizations, government organizations, that is actually mandated to advocate for older adults. So I thought that this quote is really important as you're interacting with AAAs and state area agencies on aging, to remind them that they're supposed to serve as an advocate and focal point for older individuals within the community, And that's not just for their grant offered services, but beyond that, they're supposed to be leading cooperation with other agencies, organizations, and individuals participating in activities under the plans that they have, whether it be the state plan or the area plan. They're supposed to monitor, evaluate, and comment on policies, programs, hearings, levies, and community actions which will affect older adults. So I think that sometimes it's good for us as stakeholders to remind them that this is part of their role and that we would like them to be thinking about a broad array of services above and beyond the grant-funded programs. So like I mentioned, they do have a special advocacy responsibility. As AAAs, they are supposed to be the public advocate for the development and enhancement of comprehensive and coordinated community-based systems of service specific to each planning and service area. And they're supposed to understand the needs of and represent the best interest of older adults and caregivers. So this is really important with vision loss and low vision, that they understand that this is something that they need to advocate for, because it's something, like we've mentioned already today, that it is impacting all of us at one point, and it's not a special interest situation. It's something that they need to have as part of their planning so that everyone has the opportunity to age well. So I don't probably need to, this is preaching to the choir, but examples of effective advocacy include additional funding for services, expansion of services, elimination of wait lists. So this is our job as stakeholders, but also the area agencies on aging and state units on aging should be advocating for these sorts of things. Better outreach and support to those in greatest social need and greatest economic need. Systems to better recognize and address the needs of older adults and family caregivers. Addressing ageism and promoting age-friendly policies, participation in advocacy coalitions, and education to all of our legislatures and decision makers. And the area agencies on aging and state units on aging should be participating in that education to elected officials as well. All right, now a bit more on OAA funding. I know Allison already talked about it, but next slide we will have some more details. So recap on how funding worked with the final fiscal year 2024 levels. As I said before, a lot of the work that we pay attention to and that is spoken of most regularly is the Title III. So Title IIIB supportive services ended up being level funded last year. The National Family Caregiver Support Program had a $2 million bump for projects, which is not very much in the grand scheme of things, but it's always nice to see a move upward. The Native American programs had level funding. Where we saw more of the boost was in the nutrition programs for congregate meals, home delivered meals. And also we had level funding for the Title IIID evidence-based health and wellness programs. And for the president's budget for 2025, he is proposing level funding for all services except for nutrition, with a 15% increase for congregate meals, 22% for home delivered, and a 50% cut to the NSIP. So the budget process may be worse in the coming fiscal year. We're stuck with caps from the May 2023 debt ceiling. So we only really have an opportunity to grow programs by 1% for everything that's not related to defense. So we have to keep this in mind when we're thinking about budget. Talking about the OAA authorization, this was already covered in large part by Allison. I think that it's really wonderful that you're working with her and that work group. And I will kind of conclude here. There's more slides that people can reference later with a bit more information on reauthorization. But that was a summary of how the Aging Network works. And I would just say that you have seats at many tables, local, state, and federal. Make your voice heard. And one thing to remember that always encourages me is that incremental activism is powerful. Small changes that may seem frustrating over a long time do make a huge difference. So thank you to all of you for what you do every day.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you for that. And I just have to say, looking at your advocacy slide and seeing the things that many of us do as part of ABLNC or VSA or the other coalitions that we're involved with, it's really gratifying to see that your suggestions are exactly the type of activity that we participate in. In the name of keeping us on track, we're really right on time. I'm going to shift to Pris Rogers and Mark Reichard. Pris, you both can introduce yourselves, but what I will say is they are the co-chairs of the policy committee of AVLNC, again administrated by VSA, and it is truly my pleasure to have gotten to know both of them over the course of the last 8 months. It's thrilling when I do research for VSA and read clinical articles and they have Chris Rogers' name on the bottom of it, and I didn't know that as I'm reading the article, or when I'm reading reaction letters to things or actual policy that's in place and then discover that Mark is the author of those particular things. That has really been a pleasure, and we are really very, very grateful, and we're really blessed as a community to have two such strong advocates who've dedicated so much time in their careers to the things that we collectively advocate for. So that's my introduction of them for them. But Pris, I will turn it to you and Mark to launch your part of the presentation or say anything else that adds to that.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jason. I do want to say that if anybody has questions for Meredith, I hope she can stay around after so we can have a few more questions. If not, we'll do email like we were going to do with Allison as well. So if that's okay. So you kind of stole my thunder, Jason. I was going to talk about Mark and I being the co-chairs of the Policy and Funding Committee. We've been doing that since the inception in 2019. But the part you didn't say, and I have to put it out there, is that between the two of us, we have over 75 years of experience. And I'll let you all guess who has the most. But anyway, just had to throw that out. Anyway, okay. So Mark and I are going to do a little Q&A thing to kind of mix it up and make it a little bit more interesting than just a straight presentation. So Mark, you were going to ask me a question that hopefully I can answer.
Oh, that was your first mistake.
No.
You're at my mercy. So I don't know if Meredith is still around. One of the things that I know, Pris, you and I were, oh gosh, I surprised, concerned about, raised red flags for us, is that when we started working with Meredith, a year and a couple months ago, to put together some of the specific changes that we're all recommending to Congress for the Older Americans Act, Meredith was very careful to say, look, the Older Americans Act is super indispensable. You can't talk about aging services in this country without talking about OAA. And yet her point, which just echoes in my head, is that as indispensable as OAA is, it's not the only game in town. And even if we got all of the changes that we were asking for in the Older Americans Act, there's a heck of a lot more to be done. And we'll get to what those other sort of broader, longer range goals are in a second. But maybe, Pris, perhaps you can walk through some of the changes that we are specifically recommending that our community advocate for Congress to incorporate in the Older Americans Act, whenever it is they get around to actually reauthorizing it. We've talked about this thing called a request for information or responding to the RFI. And we've got, oh gosh, I think, what was it, Chris, 26 pages of amendments, but I know you can boil it down for us. So perhaps you can sort of highlight the big themes of those requests.
Yes, I'm going to do that. And the RFI, by the way, it was shorter. We responded directly to the questions that the Senate sent out, but we did send like 20 some pages of changes. But the highlighted changes that we had in the RFI were that we want to see the specific inclusion of the definition of vision rehabilitation services, because we feel like that's critical, that they need to understand the importance of that. And in order to go forward and having any kind of services provided, that definition really needs to be in the Act. We also talked about the inclusion of older individuals with vision loss, older people with hearing loss, and of people who have both, because people with hearing loss are also not pulled out as well. And we thought that was a really critical thing, and all the advocates that we worked with have felt strongly about that as well. We also, another thing we talked about was clarifying that people who are institutionalized or who may be at risk of institutionalization, which include a number of older people whom we serve, be called out because the existing service delivery system fails to recognize or provide a knowledge of the value of vision rehab services. And we have a report that John Cruz and other folks have been involved in writing in 2021 from the state of Delaware, showing that the overall prevalence of vision loss in that state in nursing homes was 63.8%. Now that's downright criminal. That's all I got to say. Even though I'm being recorded, I'll say it. What can I say? Another thing that we really wanted to talk about was the definition of severe disability. And that's when we worked on the rule, you heard Meredith talking about the rules that came out in the spring. We really we talked about severe disability and said that we didn't feel that that necessarily included people who were deaf, hard of hearing, blind, or visually impaired in the definition of physical and mental disabilities. So the ACL disagreed with us, and they came back and said that although they were going to leave the term severe disability in the act, they felt like people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or blind or visually impaired were implicitly included. Well, we all know that isn't so, and we know that a lot of older people new to vision loss do not even identify with being severely disabled, nor are they. And service providers do not automatically consider them. So that's our big problem, is bringing the knowledge base and the understanding that older people with vision loss really need to be included in the Older Americans Act for a variety of reasons, not only because of their vision issues, but because of all those other things that occur as a result. And we have the big data report, and we brought that up in our RFI about the older people with vision loss and their other chronic conditions and so forth, and how that all adds together to have a perfect storm. So in closing, in our RFI, we agreed with our colleagues at the AAVL, and Doug's going to speak here in a few minutes, that we requested Congress to explicitly include and recognize older Americans with vision or hearing loss as a distinct, important, and vastly underserved segment of the older population. So that was our main message, and that's also what we have put out in that information that we've given to advocates to take to their congressional offices. If we have time to talk about that, we will later. But those are the main things that we covered. We also talked some about establishing some other things like the Office on Aging and Vision Loss, but I'm going to leave that to Mark to talk about when we get ready to talk about the Teddy Joy bill.
Well, so Chris, let me follow up with you on on this point about calling out a specific population. I mean, and you and I talked about this even sort of just privately, the outrage of having a federal agency hearing from consumers, professionals in blindness who say, look, we are not being acknowledged in the regulations. So Administration for Community Living, since you seem determined to revise your regulations, we need to be called out because our people, you may think we're implicitly included, but our people are explicitly excluded. At least it seems like that's true in practice. I mean, just amplify that point a little bit more and address, and I know Doug will reinforce this, how we go about articulating that just because our folks may be quote unquote blind or visually impaired or blind or low vision, you know, the truth is they do not identify as being people with disabilities. By and large, older people do not. And how that ends up as a practical matter being a limitation, and why therefore as a policy matter we need to have a specific carve out in law and regs on a population which they frankly just simply appear recalcitrant to recognize.
Well, I think you've said it pretty well, and I know Doug is going to talk about this. The AAVL has done some research with the Aging Network and determined that all the ones that they did research with are not involving older people with vision loss. And there are a lot of reasons. I mean, as we said, that people don't identify, they're socially isolated, they're afraid to go out, they don't know about services, and they don't know that they're eligible for them. There are just so many different parts of it that, but the part that makes me the maddest is that you'd think that aging service providers would be able to recognize when they have a person who has vision loss coming into their program and want to do something. And I'm not saying they don't, but the recognition for some unknown reason isn't there. And I've never been able to understand that. And like I said, I've been in this work for a long time, but we really need to have it explicit in the act so that it can get into the state plans. You heard Meredith talking about the state plans and all of that. And we've got to get it there so that it can at least be recognized, and we have a chance to talk about it when we have these state plan meetings and the states are doing that kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge, right, is that if our population is not specifically pulled out, then it's also very difficult to talk about what it is in terms of services and programs and the questions even that are asked at the initial stage. Who are you anyway? How can we serve you? Those kinds of very sort of, condition specific or vision specific issues get lost in the shuffle, which is why part of our request to Congress is not only to recognize our population in a distinct fashion, but also the services that we need. So talk a little bit about, Chris, if you would, the notion of trying to promote, amplify vision rehabilitation services and how we intend to do that, as well as accessibility, of course, in our amendment recommendations.
Well, I mean, as I said when I did the presentation, we're trying to get vision rehab into the definitions because service providers, the Aging Network doesn't recognize vision rehab. They don't know what it means. And so it's so critical that as a part of what we do, we get that information in there and the explanation of it, because it's not a normal service. It's not the Meals on Wheels. It's not all these other things that Meredith talked about. It's an entity that they don't, a service that they don't even know exists nor know what it does. And the other part, I think, in the Older Americans Act, and what I've seen over the years, and there's nothing against it, we're providing supportive services, okay? That's really what a lot of the Older Americans Act is about. And that does lead to helping people remain independent, but it doesn't include the next step, which is helping a person who has disabilities become more independent. And they don't seem, there's a lot of work to be done in that arena, I think. And that's what we're trying to do here with the vision rehab piece, I think.
Putting it another way, right? If even if they acknowledge this population, and even if they have a sense of exactly what it is they think that, quote unquote, we need, where are the resources to whom they can refer our people? And it sounds like that's a pretty significant gap, right?
Oh, absolutely. Which you're going to get to talk about in just a minute.
So over to you. So you can quiz me. You can cross-examine me in front of all of our friends.
Oh, how fun. I probably won't have to do much cross-examination. So there you go. So one of the most exciting things I think we have done in this work is working on a bill called the Teddy Joy bill. And it's a message bill. And Mark will explain to you, I think, what he means by message bill as opposed to other types of bills. But this whole idea of it is to strengthen the services for older blind programs and include them in the Older Americans programs and so forth. So Mark, tell us about Teddy Joy and what the titles involve.
Well, I think I'm right about this, that we have referred people in the chat or some other place, or perhaps even in the promotional materials for this webinar, to a number of resources, including at least one, if not a couple of one-pagers that reflect exactly what it is that we're asking for. So for sure, we're focused, in the immediate future, and by that I mean in the next 6 months or so, on the Older Americans Act, because as Allison mentions, the official end date, if you will, on the books is September 30th of this year. The likelihood, and Allison has affirmed this for us, we're going to be living with this for a long time. But the Older Americans Act is what is most uppermost, or whatever, at least chronologically, in the members of Congress who actually care about this, and that mostly is on the Senate side, and that's mostly among Senate Democrats. The process is definitely bipartisan, but for sure, since the Senate is controlled by Democrats, they're really driving the agenda over there. The House seems to be in a bit of a in limbo or purgatory, or whatever word is best appropriate there. But for sure, the Older Americans Act is immediately on the agenda, but we're going to be living with this stuff for a long time, which is why the Aging and Vision Loss National Coalition, AVLNC, has been focused on these longer range goals. And the way that we've sort of framed this is that the Older Americans Act is just one of 3 legs to a hopefully not too rickety stool. So we for sure need to see changes in the Older Americans Act to make sure that funding is going to services that specifically meet the unique needs of a population that they really do not yet fully understand. And we've briefed about that. But there are 2 other pieces to that. And one of those pieces is about shoring up and strengthening and amplifying the role of the one program that we have in this country that is dedicated to older people with vision loss, namely the Older Blind Program and the OIB program. So the Teddy Joy's Law, which is draft comprehensive legislation to address all of these sorts of things, goes on at some length, and we've provided you all with an outline to it, and we hope you will check it out. Talks about how to do that, how to take this very small program that only serves about 3% of the humans who are eligible for the Older Blind program, and tries to build regular, predictable, automatic, mandatory funding increases for that program. Allison, I think, clarified for all of us that the Older Americans Act is all about authorizing programs and establishing programs and defining the contours of those programs. But even if we're 100% successful there, we need to shift as well into looking at how we promote funding for those programs and others. And the funding process is an annual process, and we're in the midst of one now because we're in an election year. It's it's all confused, dazed and confused. But it's one of those things where you get two bites of the apple. You have to establish the program, you have to define exactly what you mean by that. And then once you do that, there's an entirely separate process that comes along and says, we need additional money for all of those programs we've identified. So in addition to the Older Americans Act stuff that we've been talking about, that's the first leg of the stool. The second is about saying that the Older Blind program in this country needs to be a bit revamped to focus the services that are authorized under that program on the most significant services where we can make the greatest impact, and how we can escape from this sort of discretionary funding cycle where every year we're begging for additional dollars, and more often than not we don't get them, or we get some pittance that doesn't even allow us to keep pace with cost of living, etc. And if you read the outline for Teddy Joy's Law, you'll see what more we mean by that. And then the third leg of the stool is all about how we coordinate all this stuff, because under the Older Americans Act, there's lots of little programs in there, many of which don't understand who it is who shows up on their doorstep, who may be blind or visually impaired, or blind and low vision, who are older folk, or people like my 84-year-old mama who, she's not visually impaired, she just can't see too well, which means they never identify as people with visual disability, with a capital D disability. So how do we meet their needs, and how do we make sure that the Older Blind program, as small as it is and is in desperate need for more money and more focused structure, how do we make sure that's incorporated and effectively linked with the aging network that Allison and Meredith talked about? So that third leg of the stool tries to do that, which is to say that while we're going to leave the Older Blind program within the U.S. Department of Education at the Rehabilitation Services Administration for all kinds of practical and political and historical reasons, there's clearly a need to build in a structure within the United States Department of Health and Human Services where our beloved Medicare and Medicaid programs live, and a whole host of other health-related services and programs and policies resides. And so we talk about the establishment of an Office on Aging and Vision Loss. And this is not, hopefully, just another bureaucracy that we established there, but as is a federal champion for the whole host of things we've been talking about for the last hour. An Office on Aging and Vision Loss that will have authority to fund personnel preparation, not only for the certified professionals we care about, but also trying to cross-fertilize knowledge from our field within the geriatric, gerontological, and other fields, and to spur innovation and pilot projects, particularly among private agencies for sure, as well as potentially establishing a new program that would fund technologies specifically meeting the low vision and related assistive technology needs for older people with vision loss. So those are sort of the three things, Chris. the
Mark,
Older
it's
Americans Act
it,
changes, the OIB program changes, and then these connectivity points. So, Pris, give it your best shot. What's the question you've always been wanting to ask me that you can ask in front of other people, that is?
and that he could answer in 2 minutes.
Yeah, or without violating a court order. Yes.
Well, what part of that you think right now, while we are talking about the Older Americans Act reauthorization, is there any part of that that we haven't already talked about with regard to the reauthorization that we need to include? Is there something we've left out? Is there some critical piece that you think we need to let advocates know about that would be really important to push?
Well, probably the biggest thing is, so you talk to a policymaker, you talk to their 27-year-old staff person who may not know anything about what we're talking about. What the heck is it that, so what do you want, right? What is it you want from them? I mean, the longer range answer to that, of course, is we want to see the amendment language we've talked about added to the Older Americans Act. We want to see the Older Blind program better structured. We want to see this connectivity among all of the various programs out there and to establish a bit more of a presence within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. But that's a heck of a lot of detail. And the simple truth of it is that Allison has reflected this, Meredith has reflected in it, Pris, you and I have talked about this through many tiers, frankly, literal and figurative. I mean, this field does not have a core of champions on Capitol Hill for any of this. It's been one of the joys of my life to work with our friends in the American Council of the Blind, and Doug's going to address some of the more consumer-oriented stuff about that on a whole host of things. And in the AER context, our professionals, of course, we care about web accessibility, we care about textbook accessibility, we care about technology accessibility, on and on. Civil rights protections, we have champions that we've cultivated in each of those areas. And the public policy structures we have in this country reflect that. We do not yet have champions who are willing to go to the mat for this community. So, I mean, if I were waving a magic wand and someone said, bless me with some gift that if I said the right words to a young staffer, or if I even get to talk directly to a policymaker, what the heck is it that you want them to do for us? The details are obviously important, and you've got, you all, materials that we put together, including the one-pagers, et cetera. What you're really asking for them to do is to commit to this community to be a long-term champion for us. The Older Americans Act will get reauthorized this year, or it won't. And if I were a betting guy, which I'm not, I would say it probably won't be reauthorized this year. If I'm wrong about that, it will be reauthorized this year. And as Allison told you, it's going to be a super modest reauthorization, which means whatever comes out of that process, if they actually do something this year, it's going to be pretty limited, which means we are in this game for the long term. So you've got materials. I would say, in 3 words or 2.5, go get them. And what you're trying to get them to do is to not so much worry about the details, as critical as they are, but to be champions for this community. And how do you do that? You already know the answers to that. I mean, when you reach out to members of Congress or to their staff, you are the incarnate, representation of the expertise of this field. You know better than any of the rest of us do on what struggles you're dealing with as service providers or as consumers or as individual professionals, and simply say to them, our folks are getting the short end of the stick, to say the very least, and we need you, madam, sir, to be a champion for us. And there are specific ways they can do that. They can push specific amendments in the next few months and urge Senator Casey, or in the case of the United States Senate, the chair of the committee that's responsible for all this, which is the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, or HELP Committee, chaired by Mr. Bernie Sanders. You can ask his staff to incorporate some of the language that we're talking about. But we are in this for the long haul, and anything that any of you can do to help us build and maintain and sustain, cultivate champions. God bless you for that work.
Mark, that's an incredible summary, and you give me another good point to put a period on. So that's where I'm gonna put it. And I am gonna add, you talked about the three-legged stool. I'm just gonna add something else that AVLNC and VSA have worked on. We also did talk about some of the expansion efforts for Medicare.
And that would be the fourth leg if
Yep,
we were going to do
that
what
would be
you
the
make a more sturdy stool
Yep.
for sure.
Exactly.
Yep.
And just because it's so timely, and we really did talk a lot about vision rehabilitation services, like and adding a fourth leg. I did send out something today to many people on this call, but I'll ask Helen to put it in the chat. I won't hijack our discussion because I think the OIB and the Older Americans Act is what we're talking about today. But there was something that came out where people can sign their voice on, let their voice be heard about Medicare Advantage programs, considering some of our vision rehabilitation services. So Helen, I'll ask you just to throw my email today and the corresponding letter from the Item Coalition, which many on this call sit on, with me as well in the chat. And on that, I really do want to thank you and Pris, because I don't want Pris to have to thank you herself and you. I really want to thank you both for this. I feel like I could sit back and listen to the two of you ask each other questions and talk about this in such an educated way, for hours on end. Unfortunately, we don't have those. And I do want to give our good friend Doug Powell the opportunity to speak. But I do want to let Pris Rogers introduce Doug Powell, because I'm sure she'll do it better than I. So go ahead, Pris.
Well, I talked to Doug this morning about how I ought to introduce him, and I was going to talk about his years in the triathlon business, or what he's done in that and all that stuff. But what he said he wanted me to talk about was he's the president of the Alliance on Aging and Vision Loss, and that group has been very involved in advocacy efforts, which is why he's here at the table with us. And he's been on the ACB board for 7 years and on our AVLNC steering committee, and has brought a lot to that. And so I'm just really thrilled that he's here with us today to talk about the advocacy and just the kind of thing that Mark was just talking about, how important it is to start working on getting those champions. So Doug, take it away.
Thanks, Pris. And thank you, Jason and Mark and Lee and, and Helen. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that Mark touched on it. We have different activities of daily living that are at risk when we start losing our vision. And so that's, part of the problem with the AAAs is they don't even know what questions to ask for the most part. So I just wanted to throw that out there. That's one of the things that I've been sort of harping on for the last several months. That one thing was I actually got it to express it earlier to Allison, because it just felt like it was more of the same. We were, there was a lot of discussion, but nothing pertinent to the community of people who are blind and low vision. And so I wanted to ask her, are we doing the right thing? Are people seeing it as their future? Last week, I think I noticed that one of the AAVL, Alliance on Aging and Vision Loss, which is an affiliate of the American Council of the Blind, our ad line ought to be paving the way for your future. As people get older, if they live long enough, they're probably going to lose some vision. So what we want is to create that continuum of services, and hopefully the AAAs and the senior centers would become integral to that. So that people, as they lose more and more vision, can get the services they need so that they can stay at home and not be institutionalized. So I took over as president of AAVL 2 years ago, and we were just starting. Anicio Correa, who many of you probably know, and Larry Johnson, who I think many of you may know also, had been working on trying to get a sense of how, where are the AAAs in terms of including people with low vision and blind in their services and in their programs and in their outreach. So they developed a questionnaire, and our members, we have now 164 members, and We had at that time around 120, I think. And 25 of them said, yeah, I'll contact, this was right after COVID. They said, yeah, I'll contact my AAA and see, and give them the questionnaire and talk to them about it and see, see if they're, if they have programs and services that are inclusive of us or geared toward us or whatever. And we got about 25 responses, and the answer was no. The bottom line is, with the possible exception of two places in Texas, one where Larry Johnson lives and one where our good friend Kenneth Semyon Sr. lives. They've been working with their AAAs for a long time, so they are aware of the blindness community and are providing services and programs for them, but not pretty much not elsewhere. And some of the AAAs didn't even get back with our members. So it's probably not going to surprise anybody on this call, but it's we've used this in a letter that has gone to several people as part of the reason why we're advocating for inclusion of blind and low vision, excuse me, throughout the act, because they just don't know we're out there and they have not done anything to outreach to us. And when we walk into a senior center, they don't have Braille bingo cards, and they don't have Braille playing cards, and they don't have other things that would help include our our constituency in their to be welcomed into their site and into their programs. So we when this bipartisan committee got named, we decided to draft a letter to go to them. And so we did that, and using some of the statistics from the Big Data Project, showing how people who are blind or low vision are more prone to falls. If you don't accept the fact that you're low vision and need some help or need a cane or whatever, you're going to fall, aren't you? It's just going to happen. So those kinds of things, we pulled out some of the stats that were that were most relevant, and mostly the stat that only 3% to 4% of the people who are eligible to receive vision rehabilitation services who are older are actually getting that. So that means that 96 to 97% of those who are losing vision are not getting the services they need to keep them independent. So so we put that in a letter to the bipartisan committee, and we also have we organized our members, and we also used a couple of people in the AVLNC network to hit the places where we were lacking. So I think we hit everybody on that subcommittee, and we followed up with members talking with their staff. I think we've gotten very positive results. We sent them that 25 or 26 page document that Mark referred to, that he and Chris put together about the specific changes, so they know what changes we want. We hope that they're trying to mark them up and put them in where it's appropriate. The other thing that I'm actually ignorant about that brought up today, I was wondering, I know the Rehab Act has provision for a state rehab council that helps them develop their state plans. My question is, do AAAs, do the state agencies that fund the aging programs, do they also have a state rehab council? And if so, how do we get on them? So that's a question going into the future for advocacy. And if they're not there, perhaps that's something we hadn't even thought of that ought to be in the act somewhere.
The short answer is yes, we did
Right.
include that in the 26-page thing.
Oh, good, good, good. Thanks.
And Doug, just because Mark helped me with an introduction, I'm going to give you a 2-minute warning, so you could wrap up, and then we'll close our meeting for today.
Sure. So we're also developing the same kind of a system where we're going to contact, this is next week, I believe, we're going to contact our members who live in the states where people on the higher education and workforce development subcommittee of the Education and Workforce Committee of the House, and do some educating. So we're not doing an ask yet. We're not pushing them to make the to make something happen, but we are going to start doing that. And I'll tell you this. So I think what I'll do is I'll close with this. We're not looking for a checklist. So yes, we did. We identified and contacted the members of the Senate committee. We're in the process of identifying and contacting the members of the House committee that has jurisdiction over the Older Americans Act. There's no minimum or maximum to the number of contacts that can be made to those senators and congressmen. If you have a relationship with your congressman, please reach out to them and educate them on the issues. There's plenty of information that's being sent out in the chat and that kind of thing. If you have any questions, specific questions that you want answered, talk to Chris, and if she can't answer it, maybe I can. So I'm here and willing to help you advocate for us. The thing that I said above, we're not asking for a special piece of the pie for a program because we're a special interest group. We're looking toward the future of people who are getting older in America. And I really, really appreciate your commitment and your help in doing that. So anything you can do, please do it. And maybe we'll get this thing across the line.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks so much. Let me just identify. We really only have a couple minutes left, like 3, and I want to try to hold us to time. Helen, if I look in the chat, I don't see a lot of questions, so I don't know if there's one question in there that maybe we can take, but if not, I can just wrap us up, and we wouldn't even be a minute over.
Just to make the point that it's not just about older people who are participating in the program, but we have older blind people who work in the program who don't have access to the same information because the systems are not accessible. The websites are not accessible. That, it's about total inclusion, not only for participants, but older blind people themselves who are working in the program and don't have the same access as sighted employees.
So I'm gonna, Doug, unless you want to take 1 minute, but
Nope,
I
go
can
ahead. Nope.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean,
Nancy said it so well.
right. That's what I was gonna say. I think that thank you, Nancy, for right at the end highlighting that you're absolutely right. Many of the seniors themselves participate in some of the job components for seniors within the program itself. And when they bump into that employment process not being accessible, that too acts as another hurdle for senior participation in the community that their fully sighted counterparts do not experience, who are also participating in the program. And that's absolutely true. It's a great piece to highlight for older Americans who are staying active in that way through the Older Americans Act. On that note, let me cap us. I wish to thank all of, first of all, I wish to thank Pris specifically for handling some of the introductions with me, Pris and Mark for handling some of the planning for this, certainly Helen for doing administration, our 3 guest speakers for really giving us a terrific summary, And always to thank all of you for coming to these events, for participating. We had terrific membership today. And this is really what our advocacy is about as VSA and AVLNC, to moving the needle forward by all of us learning together, working together, talking together, and advocating as one voice. I just can't say enough about that. It's really a privilege to host and honor these things and work with the several committees that are active here within them. So on that note, I'll say thank you so much, everybody, for attending and for participating. And we look forward to all of us continuing to work together. So take care, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Jason.